Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars rambling video. And for those of you out of the loop, check out my video a couple of days ago. I did recently, or my wife rather, had a baby. So the only content you guys will be getting from me for the next couple of weeks will be this kind of upload where I just talk over Star Wars Squadrons gameplay. And I only actually had time to play one game today, so what you get is what you get. Maybe put this on while you're doing something else. Anyway, I want to talk about some recent, I guess you could call it controversy regarding George Lucas and his plans for the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And George Lucas's sequel trilogy has sort of obtained a mythical status, especially among those who are unhappy with what actually happened in the Star Wars sequels. This, in my opinion, is somewhat ironic. Personally, I would have loved to see the sequels written by George Lucas, but with a creative team behind it, including other directors. But just generally, many of Lucas's ideas from the prequels were pretty widely disliked at certain points, and I'd argue even more relevantly, Lucas didn't really have a consistent idea of what he wanted to do. Let's talk about that and everything else during today's video. So the stuff we'll be talking about in today's video comes from snippets of a new upcoming book, the Star Wars Archives 1999 to 2005, which talks about Lucas's creation of the prequel trilogy and is sort of a follow-up to the other Star Wars Archives books, which detailed the creation of the original trilogy. So I'm going to link to the Twitter thread and video by Paul Duncan, who sort of breaks this down, but here's some of the new information we learned. First of all, Darth Maul would have reappeared in the Star Wars sequels and would have stood alongside Darth Talon as one of his apprentices. Now, Darth Talon is a character who actually did appear in the Star Wars Expanded Universe, albeit in the Legacy era, and as I've discussed in prior videos, George was just sort of taken by her design. He wanted to put her as well into the Boba Fett game that was at one point planned. The trilogy would have been focused on Leia rebuilding the Republic and sort of establishing a new political system within the galaxy while fighting against pirates and also new Sith, including Maul and Talon. Luke would have been rebuilding his Jedi Order, perhaps from some survivors from Order 66. And in the end, Leia actually would have been revealed to have been the chosen one because she stepped up and sort of re-established order, but legal and right order within the galaxy, which is certainly an interesting choice. About the trilogy, Lucas said, okay, you fought the war, you killed everybody. Now, what are you going to do? Rebuilding afterwards is harder than starting a rebellion or fighting a war. When you win the war and you disband the opposing army, what do you do? Regarding Darth Maul, he wouldn't have really been a dark side enemy. He would have been sort of a crime syndicate leader, having stepped into a power vacuum, which is almost like what we got in the Clone Wars, which I'm sure is how that idea actually developed. But yeah, those are the basics, and this has been a fairly controversial thing because, to be honest, at least to a lot of people, myself included, this trilogy doesn't sound very good. However, that statement in and of itself is meaningless for a couple of reasons. First of all, this isn't the whole story here. I don't think Crime Lord Darth Maul would have been the ultimate final trilogy villain for the Star Wars universe, and I don't think it would have been a relatively simple story about rebuilding the Republic. Rather, it would have probably mixed in the world building and political aspects of the prequels, which I think is what George Lucas is getting at, with kind of a natural evolution of the environment within the Star Wars galaxy. Like he says, you can't just fight another war, something I think the Star Wars sequels probably should have learned. You can't do a rebellion that's easy. It's what comes afterwards that's really difficult and interesting. We also know that it wouldn't have just been Leia because Lucas says specifically that this third trilogy would have been about the daughter and the grandchildren, where the second trilogy was about the son, Luke, and the first was about the father, Anakin. And of course, we've had references to Lucas's wanting to tell a story about the grandchildren in other places, which I will get to in just a second. So, one reason I don't think we should too heavily deride this is because we don't know the entire context, but the other reason is because this is a very old idea of what Lucas wanted to do for the sequel trilogy. George Lucas didn't have one unified vision for Star Wars. I mean, originally he wanted to do 12 plus movies movies. That later changed to 9, then to 6, then back to 9 again. And even on the topic of episode 7, we see a lot of variation for how Lucas would have established the universe and the story that he would have told moving forward. Now, I've talked about this many times on the channel, but probably the best place to get an idea of what Lucas was actually working towards, maybe most prominently when it comes to episode 7, is The Art of the Force Awakens, because that book has an entire section dedicated to the work George put in before the Disney buyout, and even some work that he put in afterwards. Now, this story treatment that's been discussed lately would have been included in what he sold Disney, but so would other story treatments, including whatever the most recent thing that he was working on would have been. We know, for example, that Luke, by the time of episode 7, would have been quite similar to where he started off in episode 8, as somewhat of a hermit perhaps, definitely downtrodden and depressed. There's that really cool art of him lying in the sand, and a recent book by Pablo Hidalgo actually says that George Lucas actually intended Luke to die in his most recent versions of episodes 7 and 8, which definitely contradicts with the recent sort of report which had Luke eventually successful in rebuilding the Jedi Order. More recent versions of Lucas's trilogy also seem to be more focused on traditional Sith and Jedi. We know that George Lucas planned to have a Snoke-like figure, which he codenamed Uber as sort of Uber baddie. Now, maybe that was Darth Maul, but I don't think it was Darth Maul in the same sort of criminal underworld role. He did include Talon in his recent plans, and you can see artwork of Darth Talon in the episode 7 art book, interestingly enough. And you can actually see smaller details originally planned for episode 7 repurposed for episode 9, especially stuff like the Death Star being underwater, which I actually kind of liked. We know there was a Jedi killer type of character who seemed to evolve into Kylo Ren. We know that the dark side users were trying to seduce Jedi and that Luke's order may have been somewhat established, although with him out of the limelight, but even still, there's a lot missing. I think it's pretty clear that episode 7 and the first half of episode 8 pulled pretty clearly from Lucas's source material, which is obviously different than what we're talking about here. There would of course have been differences. Rey probably would have ended up being a Skywalker grandchild, at least that's my guess. But we also know that at one point, perhaps in one of these various trilogy outlines, Lucas also wanted to focus on esoteric or strange parts of the Star Wars universe, maybe the Whills, maybe the Force itself, it's hard to say. All that to sort of point out that, yeah, George Lucas's vision for the Star Wars sequel trilogy changed quite a bit. It evolved since this point that people are talking about recently. I don't think it matters, and by the time Lucas had sold Star Wars to Disney, it may have been Michael Arndt who was actually producing the trilogy overview, writing the broad strokes of the trilogy, so yeah, things are a lot more complicated than they appear. I highly recommend that you actually buy this book. The original Star Wars Archives book is great. I'm sure this will have some interesting new information. I also recommend that you pick up The Art of the Force Awakens. It is one of my favorite Star Wars books. And of course, subscribe to this channel because we'll be covering more of this, I'm sure, in the future. Anyway, until next time, guys, have a good one, be safe, and may the Force be with you.